Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the My Little Grid add-on to display custom grids in your Windows client application. This is where we left our application at the end of the last video. We've put a grid onto our dialog with one column for each day of the week and one column which is read-only for a time slot. The days of the week are tick boxes, which you can tick or untick. We also have two tabs on the grid, one for this week and one for next week. If we click on the next week tab, we'll see that the time slots are not yet populated, but you can tick the columns. And the grid maintains the values in the columns as you go back and forward between the tabs. What we're going to do today is to add a column between time slot and Sunday, and this is going to be a column, and in each cell there will be a drop down which the user can select, and this will be the same on the second tab. In addition, we want to add functionality to the application to allow us to save the content of a grid, and then when the application reloads, it will reload and populate each of the grids, both this week and next week. When you put grids on your applications, you will find over time they will evolve, and you will either add or remove columns. So it's quite useful not to hard code the column number in your code. For example, Sunday is column 2. And if we put the number 2 in all of the code throughout our application, it would mean that as Sunday is now going to become column 3, we would need to run through the entire code and change all the 2s to 3s. This could be fiddly and it's possible you may miss one. So what we're going to do, we're going to use constants to define the column position. So let's have a look at the code. So in here where we've got our globals and constants, we're going to add 3 constants. These will be for the columns. The time slot column will be column number 1. We're going to create a new activity column, which will be column number 2, and the start of our days of the week will start in column 3. We're also going to create 2 additional constants to refer to the tabs. This week will be tab number 1 and next week will be tab number 2. So if we have a look at the creation of the dialog, the first thing we will do is we will make the dialog slightly larger because we're going to be adding an extra column. So let's put that up to 710. And down here where we're adding the grid, we need to make the grid slightly larger as well to accommodate our additional columns. So let's add another 40 onto the width of the grid here. Now, in the grid definition where we've said we're having 8 columns, we'll need to make this 9 now to add our additional column. And down here, we're renaming the tab for tab number 1 to this week. So what we'll do, we'll replace this 1 with our constant. That way if our tab numbers ever change, we just have to change the constant at the beginning of the program. So down here, where we're referring to column number 1, now we know that's the time slot column, so we'll just paste in the constant for that. And down here, where we're putting in the day names in the column headers, the long day is the first day of the week, and we're adding here 2 columns on. Now we know we're starting the days at column number 3, so we'll replace that with our constant for day start. Now this isn't making any functional change to the application yet, it'll just make the application more maintainable. Now we wish to slot a new column in. So after we put in the time slot header, we will duplicate that and we want to put a new column in for our activity. So we'll change our column number to the activity constant and we'll just type in activity. So that should give us a time slot column, an activity column, and 7-day columns. Now down here we are populating the first column, which is the time slot column with each of the hours of the day. So we're just going to replace all these ones with time slot. So far so good. Now we're also changing this part here for the column, because it's a time slot column of actually justifying. And we'll just check out a bit more of the code. And in here, this here is the column which we're starting to put our checkboxes in. Now we want that to be the day start column, so we'll slot that in. And the same in here. And this is where we're selecting our new tab. So we'll just separate these two. And selecting the first tab, we know the first tab in this case is going to be this week. So if we try running this now, we will find the grid has been laid out correctly. We have the time slot column populated with all the values, and these are all read-only. The activity column, which is brand new, and the day columns, which are all still checkboxes. Now we'll want to do the same for the second tab. So we haven't got the time slots populated yet, so we'll want to do that bit. So in here, where we set up and populated the first column, we'll just duplicate that for our second column. We try running that. We should find that's in there. We haven't justified it yet, but the values are in. So let's put the justification in. Now, as you'll see before, what we did in here is we set up and used this subroutine which comes with the My Little Grid library, and what this is doing is this is actually setting up to justify and lock the column. So we're going to do exactly the same piece of code. And the column is going to be the time slot, and that should do everything we need. So if we run that now, in our second grid, it's exactly the same. So we now have two grids, which at the moment are identical. Now what we want to do in our activity column is we want to treat this one as a drop-down list, so that the user doesn't actually type anything directly into this field, they will pick from a drop-down list. So let's have a look to see how we set that up. So if we have a look at the code, and in here, just after we set the checkboxes up, we're going to put our code in here. Now we're going to need two new variables in here, which we'll use to actually populate these as drop-downs. So we're using a new variable, RC, and this is a user-defined type. This is one of the user-defined types set up in the My Little Grid. And we're setting a string to be an ASCII variable 1024 characters long. So what we'll do first of all is we will actually populate what's going to be allowed in the drop-down. So this is a simple comma delimited list. And we're going to set the cell type of our RC variable to be equal to one of the My Little Grid constants, combo static. And we're going to use a var pointer to point towards the area in memory where this is actually held. Now an additional bonus we have using this is we can actually set the colour of the text that's going to appear in this drop-down list. And let's go for red. Now, having set this up, we'll then have to use a send message command to set the column format to our dropdown. So a simple send message to the grid handle using the constant of set column format, and this is the column number, which is our constant for the activity, which is the second column, and a var pointer to the RC variable. So if we try running that now, and we'll look in this first column, and as you click in each cell, you'll see a drop-down list appears with these 3 entries on it. And as you pick them, they will go in as red text. Now you can change this to any colour you like, but the whole column at the moment will always be red. So if we go into the second tab, we haven't set this one up yet, so they're still just text boxes. So we'll set the second one up, and we'll set it up with blue entries. So since we've already set up the values in here, and we've already populated the cell type, all we really have to use are these 2 bottom lines. And we'll nip down here, and after these are set up, we will paste straight in, and we'll change the colour to blue. So if we run this now, in our first tab, the activity column is red, and in the second tab, it's blue. So we have an instant change between the two. So we've managed to achieve adding a new column to our grid in both tabs and having it as a drop-down list. As I said in the last video, there's no absolute necessity to have both grids in exactly the same format. They may well be different depending what you're actually using the grid for, but in this particular case, both grids hold the same kind of information, but just for different weeks. So, having gone to the point of actually populating our grid, what we'll want to do now is we'll want to save the contents of the grid so that the next time the application runs, it can pre-populate all the values you had set up in the previous session. So let's have a look to see how we do that. Well, we have a grid action button. We're going to put the code into the event handler when this grid action button is clicked. So if we have a look at our event handler, our callback function, we'll find in here is our grid action button. Now we'll comment all these lines of code out for the moment because we want to put some new code in here. What we'll do first of all is we'll use this grid action button to trigger a save of the grid. Now, as this particular grid has 2 tabs, we will save each tab individually. So the first thing to do is to give a name to the file. So we're going to need a new variable called strFile. And we'll make strFile equal to the current path of the executable. And we're going to name the file as activity grid, and then we'll follow that with the number of the grid, as in 1 for this week and 2 for next week. So there's the name of our file. Next thing to do is we want to create a routine which will actually take 3 parameters and actually save the grid to the disk. So the first parameter we'll want to give will be the handle of the grid itself, because you may well have more than one grid in your application. And we want to tell it which tab on that grid we're going to be saving, in this case the This Week tab. And we'll also want to give it the file to which we wish to save. Now, as we're going to be wanting to save the other tab on the grid, we will copy that code and we will change it to next week. So we're going to end up with 2 files, one for this week and one for next week. Now, since saving and loading from grids is something we're going to be doing quite a lot of, we'll use our library we created for grid routines. The My Little Grid Routines library. So to save a little time, I've created the routine already. So I'll step through this to explain what we're actually doing. We're passing the three parameters, the grid handle, the tab number, and the file to which we are saving. Now, My Little Grid has some very useful routines in it for doing things on an entire grid at a time. So what we're going to do, we're going to dimension an array as a string array, which is going to contain all the information that's currently on the grid. We need to work out how many rows and columns the grid actually is, because this routine should be able to get used for any grid. And we're going to use a couple of row and column counters to row by row, cell by cell, fire the information from our grid out to this file. And we'll need a file handle. So the first thing to do, we can use the two functions we created in a previous video, one to get the rows in the grid and one to get the columns in the grid. Now, these ones are using a send message to send to My Little Grid's library to get the row and column totals. So since we've already created them, we will just reuse them. So we now have the number of rows and columns in the grid, and we can redimension our temporary array to be that size. So this is a string array to contain everything that's currently in the grid. Now what we're doing is we're using the send message command to tell the library which of the tabs, which of the sheets we wish to actually perform actions on. In this case, we're passing it on this long tab. Now we know the first call to this is going to be to the This Week tab, and the subroutine called MLG getX takes two parameters, one being the grid handle and one being the array into which you wish to put all the information. So this one line of code actually pulls all the information off your grid and saves it into an array. Now from here on, it's a simple matter of stepping through this array and firing it out to the disk. First we get a file handle, and then we open the file for output as that file handle. And then for each row in our array and each column in each row, we're firing out the value held in that element of the array, followed by a pipe delimiter. I'm using pipe delimiters because regardless of what you put into your array, you may put commas in your array, you may even put tabs in your array. So pipe seems a reasonable one to use as a delimiter. And at the end, we'll close our file. Now there's no error trapping in here. I would suggest if you're going to use this in a production environment, you would put a try catch around all of this to handle any kind of errors. For example, if you're trying to output to a file which some other application has actually got hold of. But for the moment, we'll leave that as is. So if we try running this now, what it should do, whatever we populate inside our grid, it should save both tabs of the grid out to these files. So let's see if our program runs cleanly, which it does. So in our first one, we'll set some values. And in our second grid, we will change a different one. And we'll set some values there as well. So having done that, if we click on grid action, it should have actually saved these. So we have a look at the folder in which our activity files should have been created. We now have two files, activity grid 1 and activity grid 2. If we look at activity grid 1, it has in it the first column, which is our times. It has a pipe delimited list. It has the word console in there, which is what we picked from the first one. And it has a little control character, which is actually a control 1 for those which have been ticked. And if we have a look at the second file, just bring both up at the same time, there is our second tab with on break set. So we've successfully managed to save the values to file. Now, can we load them back up again? Now, as you'll probably have realised, since we used the send message command to select the sheet we were currently performing operations on, after we actually do all the saving, it would be currently pointing at the second grid. So what we want to do is we want to put it back to the first grid. So we're now selecting the first tab of the grid. We'll want to create a load grid from disk function. And the place to put this is in the initialize dialog in our event handler. So this callback function is actually called when your form loads. So we're going to be doing exactly the same thing. We're going to be setting the file name to be the activity grid plus the grid number, which will be the tab for this week. And then we will want to call a new routine, and this new routine is going to load the grid from the disk, again taking the exact same parameters: the grid handle, the tab number, and the file from which we are loading. And we'll be doing the exact same thing for the second tab. Now, doing it one tab at a time does give you the flexibility that you can decide which tabs you wish to load. And at the end, once we've loaded the first and the second tabs, the currently selected tab would be the next week tab, so we'll just set it back to the this week tab. If we have a look in our utilities library, we'll find there is also a load grid from disk. Now this is done in almost exactly the same way. We're passing three parameters: our grid handle, our tab number, and the file from which we're going to be loading. Just as we did before, we are dimensioning an array which is going to contain the data from the file and then going to be used to fire it directly into the grid. We're counting the rows and the columns. We're using the same two variables for pointers. We're using the same two variables to actually push the data in. And we have a file handle, an str data, which is new, and our refresh. So the first two parts get the number of rows in the grid and get the number of columns in the grid are exactly the same as the other routine. We're also redimensioning our grid array, and now comes the time to load it from the disk. First job is to get a file handle, and then to open the file for input using that file handle. And since we know how many rows are there, we're reading from 1 to long rows. Now what I'm doing next is I'm doing a line input command which takes the entire line in and puts the values into the str data variable. And then for each column, from 1 to the number of columns, I'm populating the array for long R and long C, so that's the element we're actually dealing with, using the very useful parse command, looking at the str data as pipe delimited and picking out the column I'm actually interested in. So if we look at the data itself, it would look to load, this is the first element going by pipe delimit, so it puts that into the first column. There's your second one, and the third has nothing, and the fourth, and so on. Now, having gone through all that, by the time we get to the end of this little routine here, this grid has been populated with all the values that we have saved out to the file. Now we use a send message command to select the sheet, the tab, into which we want to put the data. I'm setting just this variable to say long refresh equals 1, which means when this command runs I want the grid refreshed. And there's again another very useful subroutine in the library called MLG putX. This takes two parameters first of all. It takes the grid handle, it takes the name of the array which we've populated, and then it takes a parameter which we'll come back to in a moment, and your final parameter is long refresh. If you set long refresh to 1, then the grid will instantly refresh. This single line of code will populate your tab of the grid with all the data we pulled in from file. Now if we look at the help file that ships with the library and have a look at the function reference. In the function reference, this is a breakdown of all the different kinds of functions that the library supports. First parameter is the grid handle, which we've covered. The second is the string array. The third are your options. And the option we're using is option number 3 to ensure we don't write over the row headers. Now, as we are not using the 0 element of the grids, then we're in no danger of actually overwriting any of the headers. But this does give you some options for what you want to do. You could actually save the entire grid, including the headers, to the file. The additional piece of information that's useful in here is if the op number is negative, then it would resize the grid to fit the array, which is quite useful. That way, if you're pulling information in, for example, that somebody else has actually saved, you could drive the size of your array based on the data coming out of the file. And with the op number negative, then the grid would resize itself automatically. If we run this now, with our initialization handler having the code in it to load from the disk, if we actually run it, I've mistyped the parameter there, should be hgrid1. Right, okay, if we actually run it now, we'll find that the grid is pre-populated. Our first tab has the consult in the second column, the activity column, and a number of ticks. And the second tab has the 2 on break ones. So if we went down and changed the bottom one of each to something, hit the grid action, come out of the application and run it again, we'll find it has stored and recovered the information from our file. So what we've covered today is adding an extra column, making that column full of drop-down lists. We have also given the ability to actually save your grid tabs to file, and you can also load the grids up from file when your application loads. This is actually edging towards an application that can be used to gather information, save the information, and then next time you run the program, the information will already be there. Of course, all we're doing here is just saving it to a file. You could quite happily use these routines to save the data to a database. But we'll leave that for a later video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.